Welcome everyone to our presentation on digital accessibility and accommodations. My name is Dustin Schwab and I am a career development specialist here at Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities, which we refer to as OOD. Today I am co-hosting with my colleague Julie Wood. Julie, would you like to introduce yourself and today's webinar topic?
Sure, thank you, Dustin, and hi everyone. We appreciate you joining us today. My name is Julie Wood, and I am the Worksite Accessibility Specialist here at OOD. I am also an occupational therapist and a certified ADA coordinator. One of my responsibilities at the agency is to create and deliver presentations that are focused on helping employers create accessible workplaces and navigate their responsibilities under Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the ADA. Today's webinar is focused on how to create a digital workplace that is accessible for everyone. We will also talk about some common reasonable accommodations that enable an individual with a disability to participate in the hiring process and perform the job in the digital environment. And I have a voluntary challenge for everyone that I will share at the end of the webinar, so make sure to stick around.
Thank you, Julie. What great timing with so many hiring and work-related activities occurring in the digital environment. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that today's training comes with a learner's guide and a helpful fact sheet. You can access these resources now through the link that is posted in the Q&A section here in Microsoft Teams. Just as a reminder, the information that we share in these resources and during today's conversation is for educational purposes only and is not legal advice, but we do hope that this information is helpful for you. We'll be stopping about halfway through today's presentation and again before we conclude to answer any questions. So please post your questions in the Q&A section at any time throughout the presentation so that they're ready for us when we stop. Okay, so Julie, do you want to start by defining digital accessibility?
Sure, but first let's talk about accessibility in general, whether it's for the physical built environment or the digital environment. The goal is to provide access for all individuals in an equitable way. And this is achieved by being proactive and considering the needs of entire populations, including the needs of individuals with disabilities. The outcome of creating accessibility often benefits everyone. For example, features like voice recognition or screen magnification may have been created to meet the needs of individuals with disabilities, but these are used by many people to increase their productivity or improve their comfort. And so accessibility ultimately means we can all participate and we all feel included. According to the Office of Disability Employment Policy, or ODEP, digital accessibility means that everyone, regardless of age and ability, can perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with things like hardware, software, websites, and documents. Ultimately, this means the digital environment can be used by individuals with a wide range of abilities and disabilities and is compatible with other technologies, like assistive technology, that people may use. When we achieve this, we enable all individuals to compete for jobs and to perform their jobs. And we promote a disability inclusive work culture.
That sounds like something we all should strive for. Julie, before we get into specifics, let's start with an overview. Why is digital accessibility important for candidates and employees with disabilities?
Let's first imagine what it's like to experience an inaccessible environment. I have some examples you can try later from PEAT, which is the Partnership on Employment and Accessible Technology. The first one is to turn off your computer monitor and type. The second is to unplug your mouse and try to navigate the internet. And the last one is to unplug your speakers and watch a webinar without sound. Even without trying these, I think we can understand why accessibility is important. So there are many aspects of hiring and performing work that occur in the digital environment, probably now more than ever. Making the digital environment accessible is important for candidates with disabilities because it can increase access to competing for jobs that require completing an application online or participating in a virtual interview. And accessibility is important for employees with disabilities when the job's essential functions are performed in the digital environment, like joining virtual team meetings or collaborating on projects using electronic documents.
Thank you, Julie. That is enlightening. What benefits might there be for employers to incorporate accessible practices for current or future employees?
Dustin, digital accessibility benefits employers in a variety of ways. First, an accessible hiring process may attract more qualified candidates to apply for jobs, including qualified candidates with disabilities, which gives the employer a better chance of finding the most qualified person. Next, an accessible digital environment can improve an employer's bottom line, according to EARN, which is the Employer Assistance and Resource Network. Also, accessibility may increase the productivity of all employees and ensure important organizational and training information is conveyed to everyone. And anytime we make the work environment more accessible, it can contribute to a workplace culture where everyone feels more comfortable and included. So because of these reasons, it's important for employers to be aware of the aspects of the hiring process and employment that occur in the digital environment, and then create a plan to ensure accessibility for everyone.
Okay, that makes sense. And so today we will discuss how to make the digital environment accessible. We will talk about why having a reasonable accommodation statement is important, and we will discuss some common barriers in the digital workplace and how to overcome these by sharing some general ideas for reasonable accommodations. Later, we will get into actual suggestions for making environments more accessible. However, I know technological changes can be intimidating. So Julie, do you have a suggestion for how to get started?
Dustin, I do have ideas for employers because it is common to wonder where to begin. Now, the answer to where to start will be unique for each employer because each employer is unique. So I am going to share these ideas in no particular order of importance, and then we will talk about each in more detail. So these ideas include consulting with individuals with disabilities, knowing the guidelines for digital accessibility, assessing the digital environment, reviewing requests for reasonable accommodations, ensuring interoperability of technology, which we will define later, including accessibility and planning, buying accessible equipment and services, and participating in a Worksite accessibility consult.
Great. So you said these ideas are in no particular order, but do you have any suggestions for a first step?
Dustin, I don't, because that first step is going to be unique for each employer. But I will emphasize that it's important to take a step. I know it can feel overwhelming to think about making things accessible because accessibility really is a part of everything we do in life, including all aspects of employment. And so that's a lot of stuff and feels like a lot to do. It reminds me of how I felt the day I ran my first full marathon. A full marathon is 26.2 miles, and even though I was prepared, when I thought about each of those 26.2 miles, I felt overwhelmed. When we lined up to begin the race, I remember looking at my running partner and I said, "We are going to run this marathon one step at a time." What I meant was we are going to focus on the next step or the next landmark or the next mile. We are not going to focus on all 26.2 miles for this entire race or it will seem impossible. And so that's what we did. And we ran each of those 26.2 miles and successfully crossed the finish line. Now, whenever anyone asks me how I ran that many miles, my answer is always one step at a time. And this mindset has become a metaphor for me anytime I feel like I have a project to complete that has many things to do and when the finish line seems out of reach. So Dustin, if employers are feeling the same way about making their digital environments accessible, I don't have a recommendation on which step is most important to take first. I just want to inspire employers to take that first step and then keep focusing on the next one.
Julie, that is a great analogy. So let's talk about some of the ideas you shared with us in more detail. You mentioned consulting with individuals with disabilities. How can this be helpful?
Dustin, this can be helpful because individuals who encounter barriers in the digital environment know what those barriers are and may already know how to remove them. Also, individuals with disabilities may use assistive technology. For example, an individual with a physical disability that limits typing may use speech-to-text software to perform work tasks like sending email, creating documents, and researching information on the internet. So talking with individuals with disabilities informs employers of what assistive technologies are being used so they can make sure these work with the technology in their environment. And make sure to talk with a range of individuals with disabilities so you understand all the barriers that may be present. All the information you obtain may help you prioritize where to begin.
How can employers go about consulting with individuals with disabilities?
Dustin, one idea is to ask the employees you know have a disability about their experience working in the digital environment and whether they encounter barriers. Sometimes an employer knows an employee has a disability, either because the disability is visible or the employee uses a reasonable accommodation. Now, if you do this, tell the employee why you are asking, advise the employee that providing feedback is not required, provide the employee with written informed consent, and follow the guidelines for confidentiality. Or you could create a needs assessment that you distribute to all employees and indicate that the completion of the assessment is not mandatory. If you have an employee resource group, another idea is to talk with these members and ask if they know of any barriers and have ideas for solutions. And one last idea is to review online resources and watch videos that demonstrate how individuals with disabilities access the digital environment.
Well, that sounds like a great way to get information. Next, I imagine an employer would need to know how to remove digital barriers. You said that it was important to know accessibility guidelines. What do I need to Google to find them?
Dustin, we included resources in the Learner's Guide so employers can quickly find the accessibility guidelines. However, the first search I recommend is for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which are a single standard shared internationally to make the web accessible for everyone, including individuals with disabilities. We provided a resource from the Web Accessibility Initiative's website, which includes a comprehensive overview of the guidelines, tips and tutorials, a free online course, and some evaluation tools to check accessibility. So that's a great place to start.
Julie, as we're talking about digital accessibility, I'm realizing that it includes more than just a company's website. Everything from creating documents or presentations to posting on social media and participating in a virtual platform could also be included. Are there guides for all of that as well?
Yes, there are. We included resources in the Learner's Guide from entities like PEAT, the state of Minnesota, Disability In, and the Job Accommodation Network, known as JAN, which provide guidance and best practices for applications like documents, webinars, meetings, social media, emails, videos, and websites. One example is a resource from JAN, which includes a process for making an online application accessible. And another example is from the state of Minnesota's Office of Accessibility, which offers instruction on how to make documents accessible in applications like Word, PowerPoint, and Excel, which so many of us use in our daily work.
It sounds like there are a lot of good resources and tools to help employers. Another idea you shared is assessing the digital environment. Can you expand on what that means and how employers can do this?
Sure. Another option for where to start is to assess your digital environment. You may find you are farther into your accessibility marathon than you realized, and you might identify some areas that can be made accessible easily with just a few steps. So we have resources to share. One of these is Tech Check from Pete, which is a tool for employers to use to assess their accessibility practices. Tech Check gives employers a report that helps identify goals and steps to take to move forward. Another resource is a quick reference from WebAIM, which offers ways to test web content through a free web accessibility evaluation tool known as WAVE. WebAIM also has a checklist based on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and resources that address things like alternative text for visual content, keyboard navigation, compatibility with a screen reader, and how to scan for issues with things like captions and animations. And the Web Accessibility Initiative website has an easy check with step-by-step guidance for checking accessibility, and they have a list of over 100 evaluation tools. So there are a wealth of resources to help employers get started with assessing their digital environments.
There certainly are. Now, why do you suggest reviewing requests for reasonable accommodations?
Because these may reveal where the barriers are, which could help with prioritizing where to start. After you identify a barrier and implement a solution, the workplace activity will be accessible to more people, which is ultimately the goal. Just remember, reasonable accommodations are subject to confidentiality rules, so make sure to follow these procedures appropriately when you are reviewing this information.
Thank you for reminding us of the sensitivity of accommodation information. What do you mean by the idea of ensuring interoperability?
Dustin, interoperability is a term that means two or more technologies work together. While technology provides new ways of doing things and increased efficiencies, technology can include barriers. What makes technology accessible is that it can be used by individuals with a wide range of functional abilities and in the manner which is best for them, which may include using assistive technology. For example, a computer that has an accessible operating system can be used successfully by an individual using the input that is best for them, like a trackball style mouse, an ergonomic keyboard, screen reading software, or speech recognition software. So it's important for employers to know to check their technology for accessibility. And beyond that, it's important to know what assistive technologies your employees use, and then check that the two have interoperability with each other so the individual can exchange and use information with work applications.
Julie, what is assistive technology?
Dustin, this is technology that is specifically designed to enable an individual with a disability to perform a functional task. And so examples include tools like screen reading software and speech recognition software. It's important to know that using assistive technology alone does not create accessibility. There has to be interoperability between the assistive technology and the technology it's being used with to achieve accessibility. For example, an employee with a disability may use assistive technology like screen reading software with technology to review online career sites or complete an online application, or to send and receive emails at work. So knowing the relationship or interoperability between certain technologies can be helpful when you are planning and implementing digital accessibility.
It sounds like this is really about awareness, which leads perfectly into the next idea you shared, which is to include accessibility in planning. How do employers do this?
Dustin, when an employer is considering where to start, one idea is to make sure to include accessibility when you are planning anything new. Because when accessibility is not a part of planning, you may end up with aspects of the digital workplace that are not accessible. So to do this, make it a rule to consider accessibility in the planning phase. For example, if you are planning a virtual training event, make sure to plan for the accessibility of the email, any attached documents, and the online registration. When you address accessibility from the onset, it makes it a priority instead of an afterthought.
Well, that makes sense. To go back to your marathon analogy, you mentioned training before the marathon took place. I'm sure that planning made the actual process of running the marathon less overwhelming. So now let's talk about buying stuff. What is the role of accessibility in the procurement process?
Well, employers buy technology like equipment, software, and services. One way to ensure accessibility is to make it a priority to buy technology that is accessible. And this can be done by creating an accessible procurement process, which is another form of planning. So to do this, we included a variety of resources in the Learner's Guide that address how to make your procurement process accessible. For example, Pete offers an 8-step process that addresses things like preparing to buy technology, evaluating proposals, negotiating contracts, and testing technology. Disability In has a toolkit that discusses why digital accessibility matters and addresses similar topics as Pete, plus includes information on creating policies, fostering an accessible culture, identifying accessibility requirements, and reviewing inventory. And Disability In offers a resource for purchasing virtual platforms that are accessible. This resource is very timely with so many employers using the virtual environment now for interviews and pre-employment testing and on the job for virtual meetings and communications.
That's a great point, Julie. Now that employers have learned the efficiencies gained by using the virtual environment, many of these activities may continue. Okay, so your final suggestion is to complete a worksite accessibility consult. I know this involves employers working with you, which sounds like a great opportunity. Do you want to explain more about this service?
Sure. So part of my role at OOD is to consult with our employer partners when they have questions about accessibility and reasonable accommodations. And this really can cover a variety of topics like how to navigate Title I of the ADA, how to identify barriers in the workplace, what reasonable accommodations are available, and how to make the work environment accessible, whether it's the physical built environment or the digital environment. So when I consult with employer partners, I listen, I ask questions, and I gather resources and information to support employers in making their decisions and reaching their goals. Now, my services are consultative, and so I am not providing an assessment or providing a list of items that are not in compliance with the ADA, and I'm also not issuing remedies. I am here to support employers in making their decisions about accessibility and reasonable accommodations by providing resources and best practices based on their goals. And the best part is there is no cost to employers for a consult.
Well, free is the best price. Now, I've never run a marathon, Julie, but I think my favorite part would probably be taking a water break. So let's take an accessibility break here to see what questions have come in. The first question that we have, Julie, is, so JAWS is a common tool used for those with visual disabilities, and this employer currently doesn't have anyone employed using JAWS. However, they would like to do some testing to ensure their digital content is accessible. Is there a way that they can get a free trial or license of JAWS in order to do this type of testing?
Well, that's a great question, and I love the proactiveness of this question where the employer wants to check this out prior to there being a request to use a screen reader like JAWS. So that's wonderful. Also, in your hiring page on your website, maybe somebody that you don't know is trying to use JAWS. And so it's great to know, is your digital environment accessible? Whether or not there's a free trial or license for JAWS is something I'd have to find out. Certainly, we could reach out to the provider of JAWS and ask that question and find out. And if there's not a free trial or license, I'm sure that we could find some resources to test your environment for screen readers, including JAWS. So that question's a perfect example of how I can work with employers on a worksite accessibility consult.
Great, thank you. Another question, can you share a common example of an accessibility guideline for a website?
Sure, so there's several, and we will talk about some of these throughout the webinar, but one big accessibility guideline is to make sure that your digital environment is able to be navigated by just using a keyboard. Some people have a limitation with using a mouse, and so they rely on navigating with a keyboard. So that's a big guideline. Some of the more common ones are to make sure that your visual content has a written description so that information can be conveyed through something like a screen reader, such as JAWS, and to make sure all your audio content does have captions that are correct and do not rely on AI or artificial intelligence, which we'll talk about a little bit more during the webinar.
Awesome, thank you. And just since the first question was asked, someone else may have answered. They said as far as they know, JAWS offers free use for the first 45 minutes.
Wonderful, thank you for adding that.
Yeah, so thank you all for those questions. We will take another break before the end of our presentation, so please feel free as we go along to type more questions into the chat box, and we'll be sure to answer them before we're done. So now, Julie, we're going to talk about reasonable accommodations, but before we do, can you distinguish between accommodations and accessibility?
That's a good idea, Dustin, because they are similar, but not exactly the same. Accessibility is a proactive approach focused on providing access for all individuals in an equitable way. To do that, the efforts made are geared toward populations of individuals and considers the needs of individuals with disabilities. And often the outcome of accessibility benefits everyone. For example, many of us enjoy features like voice recognition to activate our remote controls, or a magnification feature to enlarge an image on a web page, or word prediction software when we are creating a text message. It's when something isn't accessible that we use a reactive approach to remove the barrier and enable access. And we do that through providing reasonable accommodation. So a reasonable accommodation is geared toward a specific individual, and the solution is determined on a case-by-case basis. And just as a reminder, employers who are covered under Title I of the ADA are required to provide reasonable accommodations for qualified individuals with disabilities when one is needed to access the hiring process, perform the job, and enjoy the benefits and privileges of work.
That leads us to our next topic, which is reasonable accommodation statements. So these are the statements that invite individuals with disabilities to request a reasonable accommodation if they need one. An employer could use these in a variety of ways in the digital workplace, like for the hiring process, onboarding new employees, and for participating in work activities. Julie, how do these statements support accessibility?
Dustin, creating accessibility is an ongoing effort, and each employer is in their own place in that journey, just like each runner in a marathon is progressing at their own pace. Along the way, barriers to accessibility can still exist. So a reasonable accommodation statement informs individuals of how to make a request so the digital environment can be accessed in another way.
So it's kind of the link between accessibility and reasonable accommodation, both of which aim to enable access. It kind of reminds me of when two runners need to exchange the baton in a race. Julie, is there specific language employers should use for a reasonable accommodation statement?
Employers are permitted under Title I to create their own statement, and often they include it on their career page with their equal opportunity statement. This communicates both being a disability inclusive employer and a commitment to providing reasonable accommodations. If you are looking for ideas, we included a resource in the Learner's Guide from Jan that has examples of reasonable accommodation statements, and I'll share one with you now. So this one says, if you require reasonable accommodation in completing this application, interviewing, completing any pre-employment testing, or otherwise participating in the employee selection process, please direct your inquiries to, And then it has a placeholder where you can insert a name, department, telephone number, and an email address.
And where should employers include their reasonable accommodation statement?
Dustin, this statement should be located in key areas. A good rule is to include the statement anytime you are inviting an individual to do something. For example, if you'd like to invite qualified candidates to view your job postings and apply for jobs, include the reasonable accommodation statement on the main page of your career site and on the application page. So if an individual encounters a barrier, the statement is right there to inform them of how to request an accommodation. Or when you extend an invite for the interview or for onboarding, include the statement in the invitation. When you host meetings and events, include the statement in the invitation and on the first page of the registration form. It's also a best practice to include a general reasonable accommodation statement in your employee handbook and on your company intranet. And in all these key areas, make sure to locate the statement in a spot that is easy to find instead of placing it at the bottom of a lengthy email or several pages into a career website.
So I'm wondering, if I have a disability and I'm applying somewhere that I have never previously applied, how will I know if I need a reasonable accommodation? What can employers do to help applicants who might not know all of the steps of the hiring process?
Dustin, often individuals with disabilities do not need reasonable accommodations to compete for a job. However, you make a good point. How would someone know if they need an accommodation if they do not know the details of the hiring process beforehand, as you said? So if a candidate with a disability is invited to an interview but is not informed of these details, the candidate may arrive for the interview and then experience a barrier and need a reasonable accommodation. Not all accommodations can be offered on the spot. Some require some planning to implement. For example, if your interview process includes a written exam on the computer, a candidate with a fine motor limitation who cannot effectively use a keyboard and mouse may encounter a barrier with taking the test. One solution might be to provide a scribe for the candidate to dictate their answers to. However, this would need to be coordinated ahead of time. So to make sure the candidate has an equal opportunity to compete for the job, the interview likely needs to be rescheduled so the proper reasonable accommodation can be implemented.
I imagine this could be challenging for both parties to have to postpone the interview to another time. Julie, what's the best way to prevent this?
The best way to prevent this is to make sure the invitation for the interview includes detailed information about the hiring process. For example, inform candidates about whether the interview will be held in the virtual or on-site environment, and whether a virtual interview includes self-recording answers or is conducted by a panel of live interviewers. If you conduct pre-employment tests, inform the candidate of whether the test is computer-based, whether answers are in essay or multiple choice format, and whether any components are timed. This information helps a candidate to know if a reasonable accommodation is needed. Including the reasonable accommodation statement will inform them of how to request one. And you can apply this to all aspects of employment, not just the hiring process. It's a best practice to inform new employees of the details of onboarding, the work environment, their workstation, and the essential functions of their jobs. And if I could just add, be prepared to handle requests for reasonable accommodations and make sure to assign someone to be responsible for facilitating requests.
Great point, Julie. Facilitating requests includes engaging in the interactive process. Employers are not required under Title I to have a formal reasonable accommodation process, but having one is a best practice, and for those who are interested, we have an on-demand webinar on our website called Navigating the Reasonable Accommodation Process, which includes best practices for creating a process. We included a link to this training in the learner's guide so you can access this at any time. So it sounds like the reasonable accommodation statement could be utilized during the hiring process while onboarding employees in an employee handbook that outlines work performance expectations, or for matters related to communication and training. When these aspects of the workplace are in the digital environment, they might have similar accessibility features and barriers. So for the next step in our accessibility marathon, Julie, let's talk about accessible websites, including the multimedia and forms that might be integrated in them.
Dustin, if you know upfront what barriers can exist in a website, then you can be proactive in designing an accessible website from the start. So let's talk about some common barriers and accessibility solutions. One way to make a website accessible is to make sure it works with screen readers. A screen reader is software that communicates written information by reading it aloud through a speech synthesizer or transmitting it to a braille display. Candidates who are blind or have low vision may use a screen reader to review your job postings and complete your online applications. Employees who are blind may use a screen reader with your intranet to review new hire information during onboarding or to access electronic forms to perform their job. Part of what makes a website accessible for a screen reader is to design the site with standard headers and footers, which screen readers rely on to navigate the site. Also, make sure to include a written description for the visual content on the site, like images, so a screen reader can convey that information to the individual. And make sure any documents and forms posted on your website are accessible by a screen reader. Another barrier can occur on a website when audio content is not captioned, like in a video. You may use videos on your career page to promote working at your company or as a part of new hire training. So make sure to include captions so an individual with a hearing disability receives the full content of the video. And make sure not to rely on artificial intelligence or AI for captions because these can include errors. For example, if you have the captions turned on for today's webinar, you may notice they include errors. So while they are helpful, they do not always provide full accessibility. However, we do correct these captions prior to posting the archive of the webinar on our website.
Julie, are there other tips for accessibility that are not as commonly known?
Yes, let me share some of these. One is to make sure the graphics used to mark hyperlinks are designed large enough to be activated by individuals who have limitations with using a mouse, for example, due to having tremors or arthritis. And one very helpful accessibility feature is to design your site to be navigated using only a keyboard for individuals who cannot use a mouse and rely on using just a keyboard. For individuals with visual disabilities, color can be a barrier, so make sure not to rely too heavily on color and check for proper color contrast. WebAIM has a free contrast checker, which we included in the learner's guide. For disabilities that impact concentration, a website that is organized and not cluttered can help an individual to focus on the content they wish to review. Often a website will include media that is audio, visual, or time-based, so make sure these features can be controlled by the individual to access at their own pace and to avoid triggers that might cause seizures or migraines. And one final tip is to make sure written content uses plain language that is clear and concise. And if it's necessary to use jargon or industry acronyms and terms, just make sure to define these.
Julie, these are all great tips for making a website accessible up front. We know barriers can still exist, and so do you have suggestions for reasonable accommodations that might help an individual with a disability access a website?
Dustin, I do have some ideas to share. Now, what barrier an individual may encounter and what reasonable accommodation is needed will be unique and determined on a case-by-case basis, but here are a few ideas. An applicant may encounter a barrier with completing your online application, so you may be asked to provide an alternative method to apply for the job, like through email, telephone, or mail. A new employee may encounter a barrier with completing new hire forms that are on the intranet, and so you may be asked to provide a scribe for the employee to dictate this information to. And although your site may be compatible with a screen reader, an employee who is blind may not have the assistive technology necessary to access the site. So you may be asked to provide screen reading software or a braille display so the employee can perform the essential functions of the job, like completing electronic documents on the intranet.
Thank you, Julie. And I know we included additional ideas in the learner's guide. Now, websites often include multimedia and forms. What ideas do you have for making these accessible?
My first two ideas I have shared before. So for visual content, whether it's a video or an image embedded into a document, create alternative text, which is a written description of the visual content, so individuals who are blind or have low vision can access the information. Also, for audio content, provide captions and transcripts and make sure to check these for accuracy instead of relying on the AI, which is built into many technologies. Employers often post electronic forms to their intranet for employees to reference, like an organizational policy that needs reviewed periodically, or a template to use when buying office supplies, like a purchase order. It's important to make sure these forms are created in an accessible format. Microsoft has an accessibility checker built into their applications like Word and Excel, and we included a resource in the learner's guide that provides instruction on how to create accessible forms. And one final idea is to make sure to use proper color contrast and check the font size used in your written materials. In addition to the free contrast checker web aim offers, they also have a resource for making fonts accessible, and we included that in the learner's guide.
Julie, these are great ideas. Now, what ideas do you have for accommodations specific to accessing multimedia and forms?
When you present information on your website through multimedia, like a video, or through an electronic form, you may be asked to provide the information in another way, like in written, large print, or braille format. For individuals with visual disabilities who experience barriers, you may be asked to provide software that permits the adjustment of color contrast or brightness and the size of the digital materials. Some applications do have built-in controls for color and magnification, and those may be effective. When they're not, there are software options that could be considered. And if you haven't provided captions, let's say for a video or a webinar, you may be asked to provide a transcript of the audio communications for an individual with a hearing disability.
Thank you, Julie. So as we are presenting virtually, I'm thinking that some of the ways that we communicate digitally might be inaccessible. What ideas do you have to make the virtual environment accessible?
Well, if you don't currently have a virtual platform, then make sure to research the accessibility features of the various platforms you review so you can choose the one that meets your needs. If you do have one, review your platform so you know what accessibility features it offers and what its potential barriers are. We have provided resources in the Learner's Guide from Jan and Pete that provide the accessibility features of various platforms. So I think this is a helpful place to start, whether you are buying a platform or reviewing the one you have. Some key accessibility features you want in a virtual platform include compatibility with screen reading software, the ability to support a third-party participant to provide sign language interpretation, and the ability to facilitate live captioning by a trained stenographer. You also want interoperability with speech-to-text software for an individual who is using verbal commands to navigate the platform.
Julie, there's also a cultural component to the virtual environment. I know that culture is a little intangible. However, I think it's likely that many organizations develop a digital workplace culture. Could this present any barriers for people with disabilities?
How a virtual meeting or event is facilitated can create barriers because there can be uncertainty in taking turns, picking up on conversational cues, knowing who is speaking, and receiving visual content, all of which can lead to interruptions, awkwardness, and not receiving all the information presented. So another accessibility tip is to review proper communication rules with all attendees before the meeting or event begins to address how to take turns, to identify yourself before speaking, and to describe visual content when it is included. And for larger events like training presentations, assign a person to check in with all employees at the beginning to ask if they have what they need for effective communications and for employees to communicate with for accessibility needs that may arise during the meeting.
Thank you. Those are great ideas and sound easy enough to incorporate into a meeting or event. Now, when barriers occur in a virtual platform, what kinds of reasonable accommodations might be needed?
Dustin, most virtual platforms have both accessibility features and barriers. So I do have a few ideas for reasonable accommodations. One example is to provide live captions for events like virtual meetings, presentations, and training. As I mentioned, AI captions are often available, but they can make errors. So when we receive a request for captions, we provide live captions created by a trained stenographer. Another accommodation can be to create a transcript to accompany a recorded version of a virtual presentation or meeting. Just like I mentioned with websites, if your virtual platform is compatible with assistive technologies like speech-to-text software or screen reading software, you may be asked to provide these as a reasonable accommodation and to provide training on how to use them. Also, some accessibility barriers in the virtual environment can make it difficult to focus on the content of a virtual meeting or event. So you may be asked to provide an agenda and written materials in advance.
Julie, many aspects of the hiring process can occur in the digital environment, like posting job openings, applying for jobs, performing pre-employment assessments, and participating in virtual interviews. How can we make the hiring process accessible?
Dustin, just like with a virtual platform, if you do not currently use a virtual hiring platform but plan to, make sure to review a variety of platforms to make sure you find one that is accessible and meets your needs. If you have an existing virtual hiring platform, then identify its accessibility features and potential barriers. Some important accessibility features to consider are ones we've discussed previously, like being compatible with assistive technology, again, like screen readers and speech-to-text software, and being able to host a third-party participant to provide sign language interpretation. Some virtual hiring platforms come with applicant tracking systems that include automatic features for screening candidates. These might provide some efficiencies, but they can also pose barriers for candidates with disabilities when competing for jobs. For example, these may automatically screen out candidates with large gaps in employment. Now, a candidate with a disability may have a disability-related reason for the gap, but if the system screens them out, the candidate doesn't have an equal opportunity to compete for the job, and the employer unintentionally risks not hiring an otherwise qualified candidate. Similarly, some virtual platforms use AI to assess facial movements or speech, which may be a barrier for individuals whose facial movements or speech patterns are impacted by their disability or medications they are taking. The good news is some of these platforms are phasing this feature out. And some virtual hiring platforms use AI to screen out candidates based on test scores, and some require candidates to self-record answers within specified time limits. These features can present barriers for a variety of types of disabilities.
It sounds like identifying where these automatic features create barriers can help employers decide when to use and when not to use AI with their hiring process.
You are correct, Dustin. Once employers review these, they can consider turning them off or permitting hiring staff to review and override these automatic features. For example, permit a hiring professional to ask an otherwise qualified candidate about a gap in employment, or turn off AI features that assess facial movements or speech, or permit these to be overridden. And if you use AI to score interviews and tests, opt to have your hiring professionals score candidates instead using an objective tool like a rubric.
Now, in addition to the biases that can be present with these automatic features, hiring professionals can also have biases towards candidates with disabilities that they are not aware of, but they can lead to unintentionally overlooking a qualified candidate for the job. So it's a best practice to provide training for hiring professionals on disability awareness and disability etiquette to foster an inclusive hiring process. OOD provides a variety of options for disability etiquette and awareness training for employers. We have information about our training on the employers page of OOD's website and in the learner's guide. Julie, when barriers remain in the hiring process, what ideas do you have for reasonable accommodations that may overcome these?
Dustin, I don't think any of these ideas are new at this point in the presentation, but the ones I'll share also serve as a good reminder that some of these accessibility features and barriers and reasonable accommodation solutions are similar across all the hiring and work-related activities that occur in the digital environment. So the first idea for a reasonable accommodation is that you may be asked to provide an alternative format for testing or interviewing, like through a phone call, a video conference, or in person. So the activity is facilitated by a live person instead of by the AI software in the virtual platform. Another idea is to provide a candidate with the interview questions in advance or permit the candidate additional time during the interview to formulate and provide their answers. Because you may be asked to provide sign language interpretation or live captioning services as forms of reasonable accommodations, it can be helpful to identify local and national providers in advance. If you do, it will be easier to coordinate these services when they are requested.
Thank you for all these great ideas today, Julie. Let's take one more break to see what questions we have. So the first one, how do you obtain a consult for someone's organization? I think Worksite consult.
So you have my contact information in the learner's guide. You also, on the final page, have the contact information of our business relations specialist team. So you are welcome to reach out to the business relations specialist in your region, or you're welcome to reach out to me directly.
Cool. Julie, can you provide an example of a statement or a form that shows the difference between an accessibility request and a reasonable accommodation request?
Yeah, so an accessibility statement and a reasonable accommodation statement are two different things. So the reasonable accommodation statement really falls under your Title I responsibilities. So if a candidate is running into a barrier with applying for a job or interviewing, accessing your career page, the reasonable accommodation statement would speak to that need and communicate for the individual how to reach out and ask for an accommodation. The accessibility statement is really kind of more of a Title II or Title III statement, and it's broader, usually more involved, and that's on a page on your website that communicates probably what your accessibility components are and the features that you offer, and then a place for the general public to contact you if they do run into a barrier. That might lead to providing an accommodation similar to a reasonable accommodation under your Title II or Title III responsibilities, but could also lead to you creating a change that just opens that up for accessibility for all the general public. So I hope that helps to answer that question.
Great. And then what is the best practice for accurate closed captioning or correcting closed captioning from a webinar?
So the best practice we follow is certainly we use a platform that does offer the artificial captions, which we know are not perfect. We also have a statement for the invitation to our webinars to request an accommodation, and when we receive that, we provide the live captioning through the trained stenographer. We do post our websites to, or post our webinars to the website in an archived format, and so we go back. The platform we use does provide a transcript of the recording, and we can go back in and edit that, and we then update that and post it along with the recording. So the best practice would be to have somebody review Likely most virtual platforms, I would assume, create some kind of transcript, and so just make sure to go back and edit that.
Okay, and I think one more question might have just come in, asking if there is any free software to test your website or a PDF for accessibility with a screen reader.
There are going to be some free assessments, and they may have some limitations and not be completely comprehensive. And so what I would encourage is to look through the resources that we provided in the learner's guide, or reach out to me directly if I can help save some time in finding an assessment that specifically does that, because there are a wealth of resources available to assess your website or your digital environment. Sometimes the free ones are brief and not completely comprehensive, but they are a good place to start. And so reach out to me. I'm happy to help identify how to get you started with that if that's the best route.
Thank you. Thank you all for all those great questions. That was wonderful. Julie, as we finish, I like to run so that I can eat dessert, but this is the first time that I've really enjoyed preparing for a marathon. Do you have any final thoughts as our employers stretch their accessibility muscles in preparation to start their marathons?
Yes, thank you, Dustin. We have shared many ideas today on how to create digital accessibility for the hiring process and the workplace, and provided ideas for where to start. Many of these concepts apply to all areas of the digital environment. And so once you know the concept, you just have to remember to apply it. Like remembering to include alternative text to describe your visual content, whether it's in a video demonstrating a job on your career page or a picture included in a PowerPoint presentation. I hope I've inspired you to take that first step and then keep focusing on taking the next one. If you do that, you will make your way through your marathon, just like I did. So to encourage getting started, I have a voluntary challenge for everyone, and I am asking you to choose your first step in creating an accessible digital environment. And then please tell us what step you chose in the evaluation you complete for today's webinar. We will announce the top 3 answers at the beginning of our October webinar to celebrate National Disability Employment Awareness Month. So with that, thank you all for your interest in today's topic. And Dustin, thank you. It's always great to present together.